The metal shrieked. It was the sound of a human mistake being dragged across cold steel. Dr. Evelyn Reed slammed her body against the industrial door, shoving the heavy leather satchel off her shoulder and onto the tiled floor. The noise swallowed the usual morgue silence. That vacuum-sealed, suffocating silence of institutional death. She didn't look back at the chaotic city morgue she'd fled. She was here now, exiled to the fading gloom of St. Jude's County Hospital. An aging, skeletal facility clinging to the edge of the forgotten Rust Belt. Evelyn was a forensic pathologist, a master of the finite, and she dealt in the truth of the last breath. The chilling aura of this place, the damp, earthen smell that suggested rot and forgotten history. She filed it under poor infrastructure. "Ragu, I need the intake files immediately," Evelyn called, her voice sharp and clinical. She tugged at her coat, irritated by the inexplicable clammy cold that seemed to bypass her skin and settle directly into her bones. Ragu, the veteran attendant, slid from the deep shadows of the cold storage wing. His movements weren't just slow, they were avoidant, like a man navigating a room full of invisible strings. His eyes, the color of old riverstone, carried a profound, unsettling knowledge of things the bodies left behind. "The files are there, Dr. Reed," Ragu whispered, his voice dry and scraping, barely audible over the relentless, low hum of the dying refrigeration unit. "But the protocols here are simple. One rule must be understood, or you will not survive the night here." Evelyn stopped smoothing her coat and pinned him with a skeptical glare. "I am a pathologist, Ragu. I examine post-mortem damage. I don't follow folklore." "I speak of damage, doctor, the kind that can't be found in tissue reports." Ragu raised a skeletal hand and pointed toward the rear of the cold storage. The room had 3 typical high-set windows sealed against the exterior, but the 4th space was an anomaly. A solid quarter-inch sheet of steel, welded into the frame and painted over with a dozen failed attempts to disguise it. It was a blank, terrifying, impenetrable finality. "That is the 4th panel," Ragu hissed, his voice dropping to a near silence that forced Evelyn to lean in. "It has been sealed for 6 years, and it must never be approached. It is a threshold." Evelyn felt a pulse of genuine discomfort. The panel was repulsive, a scar on the sterility of the morgue. A threshold to what? A utility closet? "To Sarah Jenkins," Ragu corrected, the name striking the chilled air like a cracked bell. 8 years ago, she was brought here, a young woman, desecrated, discarded. Her family would not claim the remains. They left her under that panel, and her final violent rage never departed this room. Ragu's eyes flickered with genuine, unfeigned terror. 6 years ago, Dr. Joshi, your predecessor, claimed he needed air. He forced the panel open a sliver. Nurse Kavita saw dark smoke, impossibly cold, drawn inward toward the wall, not released into the night. 2 weeks later, Joshi's body was found outside, directly below that panel. His eyes were open, not dead, but permanently witnessing. The dean sealed it then, with a curse and a welder. Evelyn felt the cold reach her stomach, curdling the coffee she'd had hours ago. The hair on her arms stood up. She dismissed the feeling as adrenaline, a defense mechanism her body hadn't needed in years. Dr. Joshi likely had a sudden, massive cardiac event. The horror is in the trauma of the dead, Ragu, not in the walls. The walls are just the cage, Doctor. The horror is the silence she leaves behind. Ragu's shadow receded, leaving Evelyn alone in the center of the vast, too-cold room. Despite the warning, Evelyn was now behind schedule. She needed space. With a grim defiance, she wheeled the final overflow body, a massive man from the recent pileup, to the only available clear space, the empty floor directly in front of the fourth panel. The time was 1:15 a.m. The hospital grounds were submerged in the absolute blackness of the new moon, the Amavasya night. The flickering began immediately. The fluorescent strips above fought hard, then gave up the pretense, dropping into an uneven staccato dance of light and shadow. The hum of the cooling unit didn't die. It devolved, losing its steady machine rhythm and gaining a strained, wet, almost gasping sound. Evelyn tried to focus on the incision line. The scent of the disinfectant suddenly overridden by a wave of something sickly sweet, like rotting lilies and dried blood. She scrubbed at her temples, suddenly panicked by the thought of contamination. Then the sound began. It was a low, grinding noise behind the seamless steel. It wasn't metal on metal. It was something heavy, rough, and insistent being moved with slow, deliberate effort. It was the sound of a body struggling to sit up inside its confinement. Evelyn froze. She wasn't standing over a body. She was standing over a prison. She told herself, pipes, expansion, anything. But the sound had a rhythm. The sound stopped, and then, from the thickest section of the welded panel, a thin, high-pitched whimper emerged. It was a sound of unendurable, pure human agony, stretched and warped by an inhuman stillness. It was too specific, too profound to be a trick of the wiring. It sounded exactly like a young woman crying for a mother who would never come. The shroud covering the large corpse on the gurney snapped taut, then fell limp, as if a desperate hand had gripped it and then released it in sudden, fresh despair. Evelyn did not scream. She only heard the word clear in the terrible silence. Jooosssstttiiicccceee. The single stretched word, Jooosssstttiiicccceee, seared itself into Evelyn's mind. It was a cold, iron spike, driven through the fortress of her scientific certainty. She didn't move toward the panel, but toward the corner of the room, fumbling blindly for the emergency phone line. Her own phone, she knew, was a useless piece of dead plastic. She found the industrial handset, heavy, dust-coated, and lifted the receiver to her ear. Nothing. Not the expected hospital dial tone. Not the hiss of static, just the suffocating absolute silence of the mortuary, amplified by the dead connection. The air grew colder still, condensing on the chrome fixtures. A drop of frigid water fell from the ceiling, splashing onto her bare neck. The drip wasn't water, though. It was a heavy, viscous fluid, smelling faintly of ozone and something sharp, like crushed bone. Evelyn dropped the receiver. She didn't run. She scrambled. Her professional training, her years of dispassionate analysis, were useless against this visceral violation. She clawed at the morgue door, tumbling out into the dimly lit, yellowish safety of the main hallway. The door shuttered shut behind her with a sickening metallic clank. She leaned against the wall, hyperventilating, the sickly sweet scent of rotting lilies and dried blood still clinging to her uniform. She forced herself to breathe, to think. The lights were steady out here. The air was stable. It had to be a localized anomaly. A gas leak, a powerful electrical short, something rational. She found Doug, the night security guard, leaning against his desk, filling out logs. His face was placid, bored. Doug, the morgue, the whole system is failing. The emergency line is dead, the lights failed, and the temperature is critical. Call maintenance now. Evelyn's voice was ragged, desperate. Doug blinked slowly, looking her up and down. Take it easy, Doc. Everything's green on the board. Backup generators are steady. I checked the line 30 minutes ago. You sure you're feeling all right? Long night. Evelyn pushed off the wall and grabbed his clipboard, pointing a trembling finger at the blinking green light labeled Morgue Utility. It's a localized failure, Doug. You need to call maintenance. I can check the breaker, Doctor, but I'm telling you, it's green. Doug shrugged off her panic. Those old rooms play tricks on folks, especially late on the new moon. Happened to Jooosssstttiiicccceee. The casual mention of the dead doctor felt like a deliberate blow. She knew then that no one in this institution would help her. The staff here had long ago signed a contract with the silence around the fourth panel. The next morning, driven by a raw, sleepless terror, Evelyn sought out Raghu in the records room. She was no longer looking for schematics. She was looking for a name. Where is the file on Sarah Jenkins? She demanded, flipping through dusty ledgers. I need the autopsy, the intake forms, everything. Raghu moved slowly to the back wall, pulling a ledger bound in brittle leather. The record is minimal, Doctor. It's what they didn't write that haunts us. He opened the ledger to a fading entry, dated 8 years prior. They wouldn't claim her, Raghu repeated, his voice heavy with condemnation. She was a victim of such violence, of such shame, that her own flesh and blood wanted her erased. She was left there for weeks before the institutional paperwork finally moved her. But the neglect broke the seal, Doctor. The disrespect anchored her to that spot. Evelyn stared at the details. Sarah Jenkins, 20. Unclaimed. Cause of death, severe trauma. But the other doctor, Jooosssstttiiicccceee, Evelyn pressed, her voice a low hum of anxiety. His file is sealed. What about the first doctor, the one who left the bloody slippers? Raghu moved slowly to the back wall, pulling a ledger bound in brittle leather. The record is minimal, Doctor. It's what they didn't write that haunts us. He opened the ledger to a fading entry, dated 8 years prior. They wouldn't claim her, Raghu repeated, his voice heavy with condemnation. She was a victim of such violence, of such shame, that her own flesh and blood wanted her erased. She was left there for weeks before the institutional paperwork finally moved her. But the neglect broke the seal, Doctor. The disrespect anchored her to that spot. Evelyn stared at the details. Sarah Jenkins, 20. Unclaimed. Cause of death, severe trauma. But the other doctor, Jooosssstttiiicccceee, Evelyn pressed, her voice a low hum of anxiety. His file is sealed. What about the first doctor, the one who left the bloody slippers? Raghu closed the ledger with a heavy thud. The slippers and the belt were Dr. Peterson's. He was the intake physician. He vanished, not physically, but he left his life behind. He walked out of this hospital and never returned. His clothes were found in the morgue, and Sarah's body was gone from the gurney. The police claimed confusion, a second removal. But the truth is, she took the first piece of him as payment for her injustice. The realization hit Evelyn with the force of a physical blow. The panel wasn't sealed to keep a ghost in. It was sealed to keep them out. A sudden, sharp cry echoed from the hallway. It was Mark, the young assistant. He stumbled through the doorway, his eyes wide and unfocused, saliva flecking his lips. He collapsed to the floor, convulsing in a seizure of pure, unadulterated fear. Evelyn rushed to him, stabilizing his head. But Mark wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the doorway, pointing a shaking finger. "The window," he croaked, foam bubbling at his mouth. "I opened it, just a crack to clean." "She looked at me, doctor. She's bleeding from her eyes." His voice dissolved into unintelligible babbling as nurses rushed in and dragged him away. Evelyn stood there, watching the sheer collapse of a human mind under paranormal assault. Mark hadn't just seen a ghost. He had witnessed the full, terrifying extent of Sarah's misery. Her scientific training was annihilated. There was no rational explanation left. She no longer had a professional choice. She had a moral imperative. Her heart ached, not with fear, but with a fierce, protective compassion. For the girl who could not rest, she needed to confront the source of the dread, but not with a scalpel or a sterile mind. She needed a shield, a ritual, a language the living had forgotten. She went straight to her car. She was driving away from the clean, harsh lights of the city and toward the shadowed ancient comfort of the only person Raghu mentioned who had spoken of these matters without fear. Father Elias. She wasn't seeking a priest. She was seeking a weapon. Father Elias was a relic in a world that demanded speed and certainty. His small, cluttered office smelled not of church incense, but of old paper, pipe tobacco, and a lingering scent of the natural world. He listened to Evelyn's account of Mark's seizure and Sarah's weeping whisper, his quiet attention never wavering. He didn't offer a skeptical debate or a theological lecture. He offered a diagnosis. "She does not want to hurt you, Dr. Reed. She wants to be seen." Father Elias stated, his voice a low rumble. "The horror is not the ghost, but the indignity she suffered. The panel, the shame, the refusal of final rites. It pinned her soul here. To free her, we must simply break that anchor of neglect." Evelyn, desperate and consumed by a cold sense of justice, pushed her fears aside. "I don't need sermons, Father. I need to know the cost. What do you need from me?" "You need courage and acknowledgement," he replied. "The spirit needs to know the living, see her pain, and demand peace. We will perform the rite of acknowledgement on the next new moon. No exorcism, no battle, just recognition." Evelyn knew the risk. She would be standing against the institution that paid her, defying her training, and facing a tangible terror. She lied to Dean Gosh, framing the request as a specialized structural sound investigation necessary to isolate the reported electrical anomalies. To her surprise, Gosh, a man of rigid rule but private fear, signed off immediately. The night of the rite arrived, colder and darker than any night before. The air was heavy, the wind outside silent, a profound stillness that felt like the world was holding its breath. Evelyn, Father Elias, and a terrified but loyal Raghu stood before the panel in the sealed, abandoned wing of cold storage. Evelyn wore heavy leather, not for warmth, but for the comforting weight of something real, the morgue's darkest secret. Father Elias began. He lit 4 thick white candles, but the surrounding air was an impossible zero. The flames struggled, leaning violently toward the panel, as if pulled by an invisible, massive current. He spoke, not in Latin, but in a low, firm, ancient dialect that seemed to vibrate the very moisture in the air. His words were of condemnation and remembrance, cursing the violence and acknowledging the victim. The response was immediate and violent. The door to the wing which Raghu had carefully wedged open, slammed shut with a force that rattled the foundation of the hospital. The candles died instantly, plunging them into the absolute suffocating dark. "It's working, Doctor," Raghu whimpered, his voice catching in his throat. "She knows we are here. She's closing the exit." Evelyn fought the mounting panic, her hand sweeping the floor, until she found her industrial flashlight. When she flicked the beam on, the light was weak and unstable. But it was enough. It cut through the darkness and landed directly on the panel. The steel was vibrating. It was no longer flat. Projected onto the surface, shimmering like a film of oil on water, was the spectral image of Sarah Jenkins. She was exactly as Raghu described. Mutilated, her clothing ripped, her spectral body covered in deep blood-red wounds. But the horror was not in the injuries. It was in the profound, consuming agony of her open eyes. They were fixed on Evelyn, overflowing with a silent plea that transcended life and death. Evelyn did not flinch. She steadied the light and spoke, her own voice startlingly clear and loud. "Sarah, we know what happened. I know who you are. We acknowledge your pain." As Evelyn finished, the spectral head of Sarah Jenkins turned slightly, and the awful keening cry from the previous night returned, the sound of endless tortured weeping. But this time, it was receding, a single dark, viscous tear, impossibly real, traced a line down the projection on the steel. Father Elias took the moment, stepping forward to speak the final words of the rite, formally calling for peace and release. As he recited the final benediction, Sarah's form did not explode or vanish. It slowly, deliberately faded, like an old photograph left too long in the sun. But just before she dissolved completely, a clear, desperate whisper reached Evelyn, overriding the fear in the room. The field, under the old oak. Then, absolute stillness. The cold retreated. The lights flickered and returned to a sickly, constant hum. The panel was just steel again. Evelyn did not hesitate. The whispered phrase was a clue, the final fragment of the victim's memory. She spent the next 2 days obsessively connecting the evidence. The bloodied belt, Dr. Peterson's suspect reports, and the mention of Sarah's body being temporarily held somewhere outside the morgue. She located an old farm property, long abandoned, near the hospital. Its chief feature, a colossal ancient oak in the far pasture. Leveraging her connections, Evelyn forced the county police chief to look into the forgotten property. They found what was left of the original culprit. The missing man who owned the farm, buried hastily under the oak. The first Dr. Peterson hadn't vanished. He had likely covered up his suspect's crime or been killed by the culprit before justice could be served. More critically, Evelyn located Sarah's family, long resigned to shame and despair. The final scene was not in the morgue, but on the cold banks of the river. Evelyn and Father Elias stood with Sarah's family as the proper funeral rites were performed, as the pyre was lit and the smoke rose to the new moon sky. Evelyn watched, finally feeling a bone-deep, profound peace. The hauntings at St. Jude's County Hospital stopped. The fourth panel, no longer a sight of terror, was finally bolted shut and covered with a revered icon. Evelyn returned to her forensics work, but the change was permanent. She was no longer just solving crimes of the flesh. She was acknowledging the wounds of the soul. Her story became the hospital's whispered legend, a chilling testament to the truth that some wounds are so profound, some injustices so complete, that the spirit is anchored by pure, violent rage. But the panel is still there, The memory is still there, and the question remains, heavy and absolute, hanging over every body Evelyn examines. When justice is denied in the living world and the truth must be begged for by a spirit, does the horror ever truly end? Or does it simply transfer its rage to the next witness?